So I would like to introduce Tez Hawkins, and Tez has a 25 minute presentation that will include some time for questions, and then after that we'll launch into the ethics session that is scheduled right after that goes, I think, until 2:15. Is that right, Tarek? Is that your expectation? Okay, cool. All right, and with that, Tez, I'll turn it to you.
All right. Thank you all for coming in today and allowing me to speak to you all. So I'll first start by saying how I got to a presentation like this. I grew up in a low-income neighborhood, Ferguson, Missouri, which I know many of us have heard of. And the reason I came into the planning profession, it wasn't initially something that I even knew was a profession. I grew up, like I said, in a low-income neighborhood, and I was curious of why my neighborhood looked one way, and I can walk 2-3 miles and see that other neighborhoods look different and much better than mine. I got to high school, and my physics teacher saw me scribbling on the paper, drawing buildings, drawing in sidewalks, and he said, first off, stop. You're supposed to be solving this physics problem. And he asked me what I was doing. I was like, well, did you see, I had to walk to school. He was like, well, you know that little block over there that has that rundown gas station and has all these things going on with it? It could look better. And he's like, yeah, I 100% agree with you, but this is not the time for that. And also, there is a profession for that. And he originally sent me to look at architecture as a profession. So went to Ball State University, started studying architecture, and then slowly switched to urban planning when I realized that that was a profession. So that's how I got here, how I got to this presentation, discussing segregation and the impacts of segregation, as well as the history. I didn't put it on this presentation, but this is officially a Tez Talk, not a TED Talk, Tez Talk. So I want to make sure everybody knows that, trademark. All right, so the findings that I'll be presenting today, I'll kind of run through a few examples of historical segregation and how it was implemented and where it came from. My findings are based off the book, The Color of Law, which I would recommend every planner, real estate agent, or anybody in this industry to pick up. It goes over issues and things that I will not discuss. It kind of gets down to the nitty-gritty, and it was very eye-opening for me, and I'm sure those who've read it's eye-opening for you. And most of us don't know the nitty-gritty of segregation and what it created today. Like I said, that book does go over those items. And I did not know much of this up until about 4 years ago. I just know, like I said, my neighborhood looked one way and everyone else's neighborhood looked another way. And then I picked up this book, and it'll change how you look at the built world around you. I promise you that. So, like I said, through this presentation, I'll kind of go over some of the historical findings of this book. I will talk about some of the impacts that we see today of segregation, some theoretical solutions, just me thinking on my pillow and saying, what can I do to fix this? What can we do to fix this? And then why it's important. Two things I do want to talk about are two definitions. One is de jure, and the other is de facto. De jure is a action that is sanctioned by policy or law through a governmental agency. De facto is an action that is in fact, but is not necessarily an action that is sanctioned by a governmental agency or that is legal or sanctioned by policy. So where did segregation start? Why was it allowed? We all know that maybe most of us know that in 1865, slavery was abolished. Section 1, as I just said, abolished slavery. Section 2 gave Congress the power to enact legislation to enforce the abolishment of slavery, as well as to remove African Americans as second-class citizens. In 1866, following up on that, Congress passed the Civil Rights, proposed the Civil Rights Bill to ensure that all persons born in the United States were entitled to be citizens without regard to race or color. However, President Andrew Johnson vetoed this bill based on an 1883 civil rights case, which the government stated that Congress did not have the power to enforce discrimination, only the power to enforce the abolishment of slavery. So with that case, discrimination in housing, land uses just opened up the floor. It opened up the floor to that. Okay, now going into how it was implemented following that vetoed bill. In 1910, Midwestern and Southern cities started really enforcing zoning ordinances that separated African Americans and whites in land uses in residential areas. This also prevented African Americans from buying homes in predominantly white blocks, and prevented whites from buying homes in predominantly black subdivisions and black blocks. In 1914, the kickoff World War I, the U.S. needed defense worker housing. This housing was segregated, and most of the quality housing was excluded African Americans, and African Americans were sent to existing slums. Continuing on with the early 1900s, the National Park Service was established in 1916. Some of these parks were segregated, and some of these parks did not allow African Americans in them. And this includes Rocky Mountain National Park, right here in our backyard. In 1920, the Civilian Conservation Corps was created to create work camps for jobless youth during the Great Depression, or leading up to the Great Depression. To prevent local resentment, these camps were originally going to be integrated into existing white neighborhoods. However, like I said, to prevent local resentment, these work camps were segregated. 1920 to 1968, so large span of time that happened here, but you'll see me still go down the timeline through the mid-1920s. Cities such as Atlanta, St. Louis, Kansas City, and many other metropolitan areas began rapidly adopting zoning ordinances that separated whites and African Americans. The goal was to keep low-income blacks from living next to middle-class whites. The second goal was to keep middle-class blacks from encroaching into middle-class white neighborhoods. Moving on to the 1930s, President Roosevelt adopted the New Deal, and at this point in time, segregation took off, accelerated exponentially. Most of the policies and the governmental groups that were implemented and created during the New Deal excluded African Americans. Going back, the intent of the New Deal was to provide relief to the great residents and Americans during the Great Depression. At this point, de jure segregation, like I said, took off. Alfred Bettman was appointed to the director of the National Land Use Planning Committee. His goal was to maintain segregated areas, and I quote, "You must establish zoning to maintain the nation and the race." President Roosevelt appointed him. The purpose of him being appointed was to visit major metropolitan areas to encourage them to adopt planning and zoning commissions, as well as zoning and land use. And again, his message to them, you need to adopt this to maintain the race. Continuing on with the policies of the New Deal. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was created to rescue existing homeowners from mortgage default. This was the first time that amortized mortgages were provided and homeowners were able to build equity through their homes. The HOLC hired local real estate agents to appraise and grade neighborhoods so that they could so that the HOLC could determine where they wanted to provide mortgage loans. At that time, the National Code of Ethics for real estate agents stated that we as agents must maintain the composition of segregated neighborhoods. So with the data gathered by these real estate agents, the HOLC created maps, color-coded maps that delineated undesirable and desirable neighborhoods. The highest desirable neighborhoods were colored green. The lowest desirable neighborhoods were colored red. And as we all know, the red neighborhoods mostly contain African Americans, minorities, and sometimes foreigners. And when I say foreigners, I'm quoting the book. So with the red areas, they were graded as risky or hazardous areas to invest money into. And with that being said, lenders would not provide mortgage loans to these areas. Businesses were told not to establish themselves in these areas. Federal, state, and local governments were directed not to provide services and resources to these areas. And overall, the country ignored the needs of these areas being predominantly African Americans. It was stated that when thinking about investing in communities, don't cross over into the red areas, which coined the term that we all know, redlining. And a specific example, in my hometown of St. Louis, the neighborhood of Ladue, which is to this day is still predominantly white, a real estate agent graded that area green and stated it is high in value because there are no Negroes in sight. Continuing on with home lending and the New Deal policies that were enacted. 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was adopted, and they are still existing today. And the intent of the FHA was to help middle-class renters purchase single-family homes for the first time. One of the requirements for FHA to insure a bank loan to a developer or even a single-family home was that your neighborhood must not have African Americans in it. So therefore, banks would not issue loans without being insured by the FHA. It was too risky. And with that, any home loan that featured an African American or was located in an already integrated neighborhood could not have a home loan or home lending. So kind of thinking about that a little bit more, if you were a white family and you were looking to get a home loan, you had two choices: not get the home loan and stay in your integrated neighborhood or a neighborhood that was next to a black neighborhood, or feed your family, put them in a nice home, and move to an all-white neighborhood. In cases where African Americans were able to buy homes, as I said, they were not given insured mortgages, or if they were given insured mortgages, the home prices were extremely or much more significantly higher. A specific example, which is not technically mortgage lending, but it referred to renting. A landlord in New Jersey evicted a white family because he knew he could charge the black family more and move that black family in. At the time, the white family's rent was $15 a month. When he evicted them and moved in a black family, their rent was $60 a month. Okay, continuing on with the practices of the FHA. The FHA were more likely to insure your home as a white family if you were located in an area that separated your neighborhood from a black neighborhood via a highway, a boulevard, noise wall, or a screening wall. And if you all look at the image that's on the screen, This is the red line map, HOLC map from Detroit, and then a aerial image taken in 1961. The image on the left does not, on the image, in the image on the left, I-94 had yet to be constructed. In the image on the right, I-94 was completed, and you can see, hopefully you can imagine that I-94 highway went straight, drew the exact line that was drawn on the HOLC red line map. Now, on the other side of things, in 1943, many developers did want to build housing for African Americans, but because those mortgages weren't insured by the bank, they built that housing very cheaply. And the cause of that, it turned into slums. That housing deteriorated and fell apart very quickly, creating the slums and ghettos that we see today in black neighborhoods. Continuing on with the policies of the New Deal, in 1933, the Tennessee Valley Authority was adopted to initiate economic growth and provide homes and jobs to Americans, but this excluded African Americans. A Tennessee public official, I will quote, "These projects are not fit for Negroes." In 1933, the Public Works Administration was adopted with the intent to alleviate the housing shortage and create construction jobs. In already integrated neighborhoods, the PWA evicted African Americans with the promise of placing them in better quality housing elsewhere. This was a lie. Their actual purpose, and I quote, was to remove the entire African American population to make room for white jobs and white homes. There are specific examples of this quoted in the book in Miami, Florida, and Birmingham, Alabama. When the PWA did build housing for African Americans, they did not include any amenities. Housing for whites included pools, community centers, playgrounds, green spaces, and decorated murals. Specific examples quoted in the book are in Cleveland, Ohio. In 1937, the United States Housing Authority was established to provide public housing subsidies for state and local housing projects. The manual for this government entity stated that it is undesirable to have whites placed in areas where Negroes now occupy. Social structures must be preserved. So public housing subsidies were only given when the neighborhoods were not integrated. A specific example in Austin, Texas, the Housing Authority did build a project for African Americans. However, the only location they could find, which they stated was the best location, was the Emancipation Park in Austin. This is a park that was segregated only for blacks only, and it was the location where black African Americans from Texas celebrated the abolishment of slavery. There was a festival held there, and the Housing Authority said this is the only location we can place it. In 1938, continuing on with the New Deal, President Roosevelt established minimum wages. The only way he could get it adopted is if the minimum wage excluded African Americans. You can start to see how wealth gaps were created and began to form. Again, World War II came around. Housing for war workers was segregated. The housing that was built for or planned for African Americans was poorly constructed and meant to be temporary. However, most public officials knew that they were keeping African Americans there, and it was permanent, just poorly constructed. Defense worker housing for white Americans was built sturdily and of quality. When it came to defense worker housing for sale, the federal bank issued white-only low-interest loans. when they did issue loans for African Americans, they were high interest loans only. Again, you can see where the wealth gap started to form. In 1949, a Housing Act was proposed. However, the only way this Housing Act could pass is if it rejected all amendments that ensure that housing was going to be desegregated. Following World War II, housing needed for veterans coming home from war was prioritized by federal, state, and local governments. The only way funding was allowed for this veteran housing was if it excluded African Americans. I want to say that again. African American war veterans were not allowed to have quality housing. They were sent to the existing slums of public housing that was created years ago, years before this. In the 1950s, dozens of states adopted amendments to their constitution that prevented integrated housing amendments. 1950s and the 1960s, highway projects, when highways began to take off, what's the best way? I guess the policy used that to make sure it improved housing and communities for all was that it would eliminate the slums located next to white neighborhoods or concentrated in black neighborhoods. This was also a lie. It was really used just to benefit white suburbanites to get to and from their jobs. And when the highways were directed through black neighborhoods and housing was eliminated, black and African Americans, you'll hear me use that term interchangeably, were promised that they will be placed in quality housing elsewhere. This was a lie. They were concentrated back into the existing slums. 1952 to 1970, the IRS gave tax exemption to public institutions, K through 12, high schools, colleges, and churches, as long as those institutions promoted segregation. In 1953, the Eisenhower Housing Administration abolished the policy that African Americans and whites received the same quality of public housing. It wasn't like this was being enforced in the first place, but folks tried, and all amendments that tried to reinforce this were shut down. And continue on in the 1950s, the acceleration of covenants, HOA covenants, were rapidly adopted, and one of the main requirements of those covenants were private zoning that prevented African Americans from moving into those subdivisions and those neighborhoods. Continuing on into the 1970s and the 1980s, so I'll take a step back. 1968 Fair Housing Act was adopted. The civil rights bills were adopted, but that did not mean anything. Segregation practices from private entities as well as government entities continued. African Americans were forced to buy homes on unsustainable installment plans, causing evictions. And if they were not evicted, their homes deteriorated because they could not keep up with the maintenance due to their installment plan payments being so expensive. This again created ghettos and slums that we see today. In 1973, this is just a statement, President Nixon stated that housing should not be forced on white communities. Public housing was monstrous, depressing, overcrowded, and crime-ridden. In 1976, Supreme Court findings found that the Chicago Housing Authority and the City of Chicago unconstitutionally, at this time, like I said, 1968 Fair Housing Act was passed, unconstitutionally rejected 99% of the public housing for African Americans that was located in white neighborhoods. However, passed 90% of the public housing for African Americans in existing African American neighborhoods. The court deliberation went on for years, and by the time the case was settled, many of the quality properties in Chicago were developed with high income high-income single-family housing. This was on purpose. Starting in the 1980s, deterioration of public housing designated for African Americans started to see wear and tear, significant wear and tear, creating the ghettos and slums that we see today and the ones that I grew up in. So as I was stating earlier, in 1968, the Civil Rights and Fair Housing Act was passed, but local governments and private subdivisions started finding loopholes to get around this. A public housing project in New York excluded those with low wages, irregular employment history, lack of sufficient furniture, and previously poor living conditions. Most African Americans were already coming from previously poor living conditions, excluded. Due to wage discrimination, most African Americans were coming from low wages, excluded. Again, and also due to job discrimination, most African Americans were coming from irregular job history. So it did not outright say you can't have African Americans in these public projects, but we all knew that language ruled out pretty much all African Americans. During the 80s, and especially in the 70s as well too, and through the 90s, to sustain white property values and keep them high, undesirable land uses were designated in black-only neighborhoods. African Americans, we protested this back and forth. It was ignored. Uses, taverns, pollutive industrial nightclubs, prostitution houses, rehab facilities, liquor stores, were all placed in African American neighborhoods. And like I said, it wasn't that there was lack of protest from African Americans. It was there. It was just ignored. Moving a little back towards FHA mortgage practices and lending practices, it stated outright in their language for their requirements that lending shall not be placed in undesirable neighborhoods that include the land uses that I just mentioned. So it did not outright say African Americans were excluded from our lending practices, but we all know that this language excluded most African Americans. A 1983 study found that most toxic waste dumps and pollutive industries and land uses were more likely to be found in African American neighborhoods. In 1984, Dallas Morning News visited federally funded, little typo in there, federally funded projects in 47 metro areas across the country, and found that predominantly white funded, or projects funded for predominantly whites had better facilities, maintenance funds, amenities, and services. In 1987, documents found a study found evidence that cities such as Norfolk, Virginia, and Kansas City, Missouri continued spot zoning to separate black residential areas and white residential areas. In 1998, a civil rights group did an analysis and found that in Miami, Florida, public housing for all Americans that was built was under the table being segregated. African Americans were designated to certain public housing projects, which were located in existing predominantly black neighborhoods. White residents who needed housing were given vouchers to choose wherever they wanted to live. 1998, I think most of us in this room were alive at that time. Okay. So I am running short on time. I am going to skip to some of the impacts that we're seeing today in African American communities. My next few slides go over how segregation was implemented through de facto segregation, lending practices, toxic lending practices, and mortgages given to African Americans, continued to suppress incomes for African Americans. There were still HOA covenants, and I think as we saw in Lori's presentation yesterday, there are some HOA covenants that still have this language, whites only, in them. But that did continue through the end of the 90s and sometimes into the 21st century. Also in the early 2000s, funds needed to provide transportation infrastructure to black neighborhoods was unprioritized to meet the needs of suburbanites. NIMBYism was also a factor to continuing segregation. So you put all of this together, all of the things that I mentioned, historical policies and actions that were done, you put all of these things together, along with hate crimes, microaggression, continued job and wage discrimination, continued mortgage and property appraisal practices, you can understand the gaps that have been created between African Americans and the rest of this country. Some of those impacts include school funding. It shows that only 57% of African American students have access to college-ready courses in their high schools. Additionally, it shows that $733 less per student is spent on $733 less per student is spent on schools that are predominantly black. And just a quick math for you all. If you take a school that was made of about 1,000 kids, I just did some quick math. That majority white school or predominantly white school would receive $1 million per year. The majority or predominantly black school would only receive $267K. I don't know about y'all, but I think an extra $350,000 would help out a school every year. Food deserts. The inequalities and practices of the past created food deserts. Predominantly black communities are more likely to have less grocery stores, quality restaurants, access to healthy food, but the access to convenience stores where a lot of junk food is sold is very prominent in African American communities. African Americans still live next to undesirable land uses such as landfills and toxic waste centers. There's less access to job centers as well as health services. Housing and poor lending practices are still being provided to African Americans to this day. Appraisal discrimination is also happening. If you look at the picture on the right, this was in Park Hill, Denver. An interracial couple had their property appraisal increased by $145,000. And the difference is, the first time the home was shown, it was shown by Lorenzo, the man on the right. The second time the home was shown, they left their kids, or he left and the kids left, and his wife, who is a white woman, showed the home, and their home appraisal increased by $145,000. Public infrastructure impacts and inequities. Again, as I stated earlier, funds needed to improve public infrastructure are uneven, and more funding is likely to go to white neighborhoods than it is to black neighborhoods. A study done shows that potholes exist more, and dilapidated sidewalks and roads and potholes exist more in black communities than they do in white communities to this day. We end up at the tire center more fixing our rims, just to let y'all know. 2 minutes, okay. Water, we all know that's what's going on in Jackson, Mississippi, but funds to improve water infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure is usually kept from black communities. Environmental inequities, I kind of started to mention this. Parks, open space are lacking in African American communities. African Americans are more likely to be susceptible to climate change, heat centers, less greenery, flooding. Stormwater infrastructure is failing. And we're also breathing in higher levels of pollution, study done by the EPA. This is a quick image of where I grew up at. As you can that's pretty big. As you can see in the middle of Ferguson, Missouri. I also lived just a little south of Ferguson, Missouri at some point. But just a quick Google map search of all the landfills. You can see they are concentrated in northern St. Louis. And I will let you know, the area that's boxed out is mostly African Americans. The area to the south of that box is mostly whites. African American communities are missing gyms. Okay, missing gyms, recreation parks, trails, recreation centers, and outdoor centers. Separation from education, social norms, and lack of exposure to culture and experiences. Violence. Studies have been done that show that communities that are feeling desperate or feel no way out tend to resort to violence and crime to get what they need. So what is the solution? And I'll make this quick. Theoretically, this is me sleeping on my pillow and thinking about this all night. If federal, state, and local policy was used to create this issue, shouldn't it be federal, state, and local policy that removes this issue? If you use the shovel to dig the hole, you use the shovel to fill the hole. And why is this important? I believe it's APA's mission statement to create great communities for all. Let's honor that. The people in the room, let's honor that. All right, final thoughts. Please read this book. I think it's really important. It'll open your eyes. And some of the conversations that we had, some of the things I said up here, they do make me uncomfortable. They probably make some of the people in this room uncomfortable, awkward. These conversations can be daunting. Sometimes feelings can be hurt, things can be said, but they must happen to get us back where we need to be as a country. Thank you. Do I have time for questions? Okay, good, okay.
Thank you for that presentation, and we're so happy that your physics teacher led you to the planning profession. So we'll take some questions at the end for both of these presentations, but we're going to go ahead and jump into the ethics conversation. So I'm going to kick it off to Karen Wolf, Morgan Hester, and Tarek, and they're going to take you through, I think, somewhat around an hour of ethics. Give or take? Okay.
Yeah. Hello, Morgan Hester again, with City of Colorado Springs. So the three of us are going to talk about ethics. We are not doing a play or anything that is the typical ethics session. We're going to be going over the changes that have been adopted this year. So this is also satisfying your ethics credit for the conference. I apologize that we are the last and that you're still here, but thank you all for being here for us. At your table, there are handouts. That's kind of a cheat sheet for what the new ethics code is. So sections A and B. Show of hands, who is currently AICP? And who is taking their exam in November? Yay! Who's looking at May? The next one, sorry, yeah, the next one. Yay. Okay, so for those who are preparing for their exams, I recommend, and it sounds super crappy, but I recommend memorizing that. Those are the gimme questions, okay? I got you. Also a plug for the study group that we have for AICP. I had a flyer at Johnny's table for the emerging young planners. We have a session that is scheduled for October 8th. It's virtual. If you're interested, they can sign up online, right? Sign up online, please. Okay, so we're gonna get into introductions. I'm Morgan Hester. I am here to talk about ethics, and I'll turn it over to my co-presenters.
Hi, my name's Karen Wolf, and I am from Seattle, Washington. I am the current chair of the Ethics Committee and with the AICP Commission, and I'm the incoming AICP Commission President, and I'm very excited to be here and feel very welcomed by all of you in Colorado.
Tarquify, former professional development officer with APA Colorado, did a lot of ethics sessions in rooms like this and made a total joke of myself. So hoping to do a little bit of that, but not as much in years past. But thanks for having me. Looking forward to speaking with you.
And I want to say that this is the Karen Wolf, so with ethics. If you track ethics, it's the Karen. Okay, so today's agenda, we're going to go over a couple of things, so some refreshers, talk about the new code, go over some scenarios and kind of talk things through with you all. Then we're going to have Jeopardy, so if you are great with trivia, this is your time to shine. There might be some little treats for you all if you do well. And then concluding comments. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen.
Thank you for that introduction, Morgan. And again, thank you all for staying here. I know doing ethics the last session is kind of tough, but we'll make it fun. So let's move forward with that. What I want to say is, yes, we're going to have Jeopardy, and yes, it's trivia, but if you're listening to this first overview in the 2 case studies, you're going to ace Jeopardy, okay? So all the answers are embedded in what we're about to tell you. So just, a little incentive to pay attention. Just as required with all ethics session, this session has been created to provide general education regarding the AICP Code of Ethics. So although the scenarios and the Q&A are an important part of illustrating how ethics applies to us as planners in our everyday lives, you need to be aware that only the ethics officer and the ethics committee is authorized to give advice on the propriety of a planner's proposed conduct. So, if you have a question regarding a situation in your own professional practice, you're encouraged to seek informal advice from the AICP ethics officer. Phone number and email are listed on the slide. So, and I want to just say that we have a new ethics officer. So, Jim Peters, FAICP, was our ethics officer for about 7 years. He just retired. Ralph Wilmer, former PDO for the Massachusetts chapter, former APA board member, is our new ethics officer. So, and he's doing a great job. So, there's part of the APA ethical suite of ethics. It involves the APA ethical principles in planning. These apply to our set of guidelines for anyone who participates in the practice of planning. So whether it be a community leader, a planning commissioner, or an APA member who's not AICP, the ethical principles and plannings can be used to guide your actions. And again, these are, you can't be held to these. They are merely guidelines to help you be a better planner and a better participant in the planning process. And then if you're AICP, you are to adhere to the AICP Code of Ethics. There's 5 sections to the code. They're aspirational principles. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. Kind of think about those as our comp plan policies, right? These are our overall policies for moving forward. Rules of conduct, again, we'll talk about these in a bit. It's more like your regulations. You can be held accountable for violating a rule of conduct. And then we have the procedures for advisory opinions, for complaints of misconduct, and finally, the options for discipline of members should they be found to be in violation of the code. Again, the aspirational principles, the code was updated, as Morgan said, after a 3+ year process, was approved by the commission last November and went into effect in January. And so we've reorganized both the principles and the rules of conduct to kind of be more in sync with each other. Again, kind of thinking about how our comp plan and our zoning code need to be consistent in structure. That's what we've done with this, and hopefully make it easier for you to follow and to find any issue you're looking for. Prior, we had just 3 broad categories for the principles. We expanded that now into 5 categories, and they include details on how to continuously pursue and faithfully serve the public interest. That's always first and foremost for any planner, whether you work private sector, whether public sector for yourself, whether you're a student. We are always working in the public interest, and we must do so with integrity. And we must work to achieve economic, social, and racial equity, building on what we just learned of the past inequities that resulted from a lot of planning decisions in the past. We just learned that. Our mission now is to kind of learn how to act more ethically and equitably in our work in the future, and to safeguard the public trust. And also, we have an obligation to improve planning knowledge and increase the public understanding of planning activities. A lot of people in the community don't really know who we are. They know architecture, as your physics professor did, but they don't really know about planning. So let's bring that forward as well, the power of planning. So we have new rules of conduct. We, again, restructured it so it's easier to find the specific rules. We consolidated them down from 26 down to 24. And then the one big change that I think is really life-changing for a lot of planners is under Section D, under the adjudication of complaints of misconduct. Only current members of AICP may appeal a determination of the ethics officer. And the reason we put this forward is that as a lot of our actions are becoming more visible, what we found is that a lot of complaints coming in against planners were what we would call NIMBY complaints, proposing a bike lane that was going to remove parking, promoting ADUs in a community, and so on. And the planner doing their job was being charged with an ethics complaint. Those were dismissed by the ethics officer, but then a community member, a member who's not AICP, could have appealed that, creating a long, horrible process, really, for the planner and having to defend themselves. Now, only an AICP planner can appeal a decision, and that takes away the frivolous complaints because an AICP planner upholding the code of ethics cannot bring a frivolous complaint. This gives you a list of the topics that were mostly come through in 2021. Just want to say this is both cases and informal inquiries, that this year alone we have well over 100 just in the first 3 quarters of the year, and we're excited about that. It means planners want to behave ethically. The vast majority of these are informal inquiries from hopefully many people in the room calling the ethics officer asking, if I take this action or that action, is that ethical? So we had in 2021, we had 18 cases dismissed. Again, these are cases that are brought to the ethics officer and dismissed as not having any claim against the planner. Then we had quite a few disciplinary actions last year, showing the range of disciplinary actions that can be taken against a planner who violates the code. There was one permanent revocation, which is very unusual for a planner who continued a consultant to use the AICP and unfortunately FAICP credentials after they revoked for the conviction of a serious crime. So cases and calls in 2021, you can see Colorado has 11, and I think that's great. That's awesome. I want to see that higher next year. This means that you guys are acting ethically, that you realize that you may be faced with a decision, a choice of taking one road or the other, and you're not sure if that's an ethical, which is the most ethical option. So you're calling the ethics officer and asking for advice, and that's what we want to see. Okay, so we're going to move on to our 2 case studies, and again, encourage you to pay attention, and these you'll be seeing these again as clues in jeopardy. So Morgan, you're up next. Thank you.
All right, so the first scenario is focusing obviously on equity and inclusion. And as with, different scenarios that we read throughout our careers. So this is about our friend Joyce. Joyce is AICP, and she is dealing with county commissioners who are not AICP. So these things that I'm putting emphasis on are kind of key to it. But there's a plan that they are reviewing. There are some components regarding equity that are being included in the plan, and apparently not everybody loves that. So the information about that was not during a public hearing. I know that everybody's reading this, but I'm just kind of summarizing it. So now we go through the thought of, so what does that mean for us? You do have the cheat sheet on there. I realize it's jam-packed with information. Not expecting for you to know the exact references, but... Oh, I'm so sorry. I was like, do you want me to keep going? Do you see it? No? Good? Okay. I'm giving a little time for you to read through it. Thank you for prompting me there. So as you read through this, there are probably some thoughts that you have regarding, okay, well, Joyce, let's pretend that we are Joyce. How do we handle that? Plans could be legislative or quasi-judicial. What information is included in these plans? So thinking through this, I'm going to go through the slides where we're talking about what the references are. And something that we talked about this before, and I think that this is worth repeating. There's two focuses. So you'll see on the top, there's APA's, what they're focusing on versus AICP. The commissioners are most likely not going to be AICP. If they are, that's fabulous, and I wish that everybody had that. But this is maybe something that we should all be considering whenever we're meeting with our commissioners or different boards that, hey, we've got these ethics that are outlined. Maybe this is something that you could consider so that when they're reviewing plans, they could have those thoughts in mind. Of course, it's not required of them, but just something that, take it home with you, think on it. So we've got the APA ethical principles and also AICPs, so our aspirational. Again, not wanting to read through all of this, but making the separation between having a plan, development review, discussion that you have with these commissioners, where's the information coming from in this situation specifically. So continuing on, the rules of conduct. This is, I mentioned the legislative versus quasi-judicial because depending on how your jurisdiction, wherever you work, how they conduct those types of reviews in a public forum, just being mindful of whenever you do receive information that's not presented in a public hearing or meeting, what have you, just taking a little time to think about it, because there are some things where I am from that I can speak to a commissioner in a one-on-one setting, but wanting to be mindful of the ex parte discussion, walking quorum, all of those kinds of things. So just want to keep reiterating the private communication. So the real life outcome, this is something that people like to see, that these are real people where these things happen. So this planner did reach out to the ethics officer, and the suggestions were to talk with her supervisor and the chair of the commission. So, it's with this, the take home for me is that if things like this happen, you're not alone, and reaching out, as Karen pointed out, reaching out to the commission, the ethics officer. Tarek and I did see Colorado as being the fourth with the most number of discussion comments and requests and those kinds of things. We thought it was bad, but Karen was quick to explain, no, that's good, because planners like us are identifying, hey, I feel weird about this situation, what should I do? So you can seek out that unofficial advice and use that however you see fit, wherever you are. There's also reference to the ICMA Code of Ethics. So this is something that just additional training and having those discussions with your elected and appointed officials whenever situations like this come up. And this, the red lines, I'm correct. This is the new part. So this slide is describing what is new in the code. So before, there were a lot less words that are included in here. That's why we have this printed out for you all at your tables. We do have more copies if people want them, but the changes that have been captured within the Code of Ethics. So being sure, this is also a big one, equity is important in our profession. That has been identified in goals, this Code of Ethics. So with the request to remove that language from the plan in this scenario, that was something else to be mindful of for principles 1E and 3. But just being aware of those types of things that are going on in your respective place of work. So I'll turn it over to Tark.
Hello, everybody. The sleepiest of you out there are the ones who unethically requested multiple drink tickets last night. I see you. I know who you are. We're going to talk about plagiarism. So full disclosure, I copied all of these slides from Karen. So that is no longer plagiarism because I'm admitting that. We're going to be Beverly for a moment. And picture me as Beverly. I'm an AICP planning consultant. I've been hired to prepare a housing plan for a county, Greene County in this case, and it's required by state law that I prepare such housing plans. So this is a good business, right? If I'm required by law to prepare these housing plans, boy, am I in the money. I'm going to go to every community I can and make sure that they're aware this is a requirement and I'm your guy, or gal in this case, Beverly. As part of her research, Beverly finds a 10-year-old plan for Lorain County, a jurisdiction facing similar issues. She decides to use the text of that plan, which she did not write, important distinction there, for the initial draft of the Greene County plan. So let's stare at that for a while and think. This is a 10-year-old plan, even though the context may be very similar community issues, similar struggles, potentially even similar solutions. Can I, Beverly, take this plan and copy it and paste it verbatim into this next county? I see Kathleen, she's into it, she's awake, that's good. I was going to call you out otherwise. After making a few revisions, Beverly and the county supervisor submit the draft plan to the Planning Commission. However, neither Beverly nor the supervisor inform the members of the Planning Commission, either verbally or in writing, that their draft plan is largely based on another county's plan. So how would this scenario be different, right? If I were to come up to this podium, and this is the town hall for the housing plan, and say, by the way, we've taken a lot of advice from sister communities surrounding us, Greene County. They had some really good ideas. So rather than reinventing the wheel, we've learned from our neighbors and we've incorporated a lot of those ideas into the plan. Unfortunately, Beverly, she didn't do that. So she might be in some trouble. After several working meetings, the Plan Commission forwards that revised plan to the county board for adoption. At the next board meeting, a resident made that charge of plagiarism. Everybody has a computer, whether it's in their pocket or at their home. Not everybody, but many, many people have a way to access Google and find this information pretty quickly. I can copy a paragraph, type it into Google, and see how many housing plans that has occurred in. Now that in itself doesn't mean that it's plagiarism. Maybe it was the same consultant who wrote that initially and uses that strategy in a lot of their plans, and they've communicated that as such to all of the communities they're working in. Beverly and the board chair defended the plan, noting that copying from another public document is standard planning practice. We joke about it, right? I heard after several drink tickets distributed last night, oh yeah, we just took that thing from Bill because he kind of nailed it, so we just copied it, and it's working well for our community too. Not necessarily a problem. Depends on the context, how you set it up when describing that scenario to your community, especially to the appointed and elected officials, especially in a public setting when you've got a lot more scrutiny. So just be careful. That's really the gist of it. So what do you think about this?